Okay, all right, everyone, welcome back. We're delighted to get started with our next session, which is about inequality and preferences. We'll be having 3 short talks. We'll have, as usual, a few minutes for questions after the end of each talk for that specific paper. And then at the end, we'll have a more broad-ranging discussion with all of the panelists and the audience more generally that we'll have time for. And so please feel free during each of those times to put your questions in the chat or raise your hand. Okay, we're going to start off with Imran Rasool from University College London for a talk on pro-poor transfers and economic preferences of the rich and poor. Imran, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Harpreet. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, so thanks to the organisers for inviting us here today to present our work. I think of my co-authors, Adnan is also in the meeting, so hopefully he can help with the chat. So our motivation for this paper is, we've seen huge reductions in the number of global poor in the last couple of decades, and one explanation for that is that there's been a huge increase in the use of poverty alleviation programs that direct transfers to the poor. And that's not just grabbed the attention of policymakers, but also of academics. And as was mentioned before, it's been sort of the provision of unconditional cash transfers has probably been the most common policy response to the current pandemic in low income settings. So what we're going to try to do in this paper is to understand whether and how economic preferences are impacted by these types of pro-poor economic policies. And by economic preferences, we mean sort of a bundle of views and beliefs that individuals hold across a range of different margins. So what are their redistributive preferences? To what extent do these policies change their perceptions of and concerns over the degree of inequality in their communities? How does it impact their pro-market beliefs, their beliefs in meritocracy or the relationship between money and happiness? And how does it impact the notion of social capital or how they view themselves and their own communities? And so we think of these dimensions of preferences as being interlinked, and especially so in the presence of pro-poor transfers, where these transfers are changing people's levels of economic well-being, as well as the distribution of well-being. And so that has potentially, first-order impacts on how they view redistribution from the government, concerns over inequality. One aspect that these policies will kickstart is the engagement of the poor into markets and sort of entering supply chains. And so there may be knock-on effects into their beliefs over the market mechanism, and potentially crowding in or crowding out of notions of social capital. So what we're going to do is take a sort of a large-scale, long-term randomized control trial that we've been conducting in about 100 villages in southern Punjab. We're going to have village-level randomization of 2 sort of classic forms of pro-poor policies. The first is going to be sort of asset transfers, and the value of those asset transfers is just over $600 per eligible. So no matter how you benchmark it, this is a very big push type of intervention. And in the second set of villages, we'll have essentially the equivalent high-valued unconditional cash transfers provided to households. And those are sort of the 2 main forms of the pro-poor transfer policies that have been implemented. There's a large literature showing that those have very high returns for the poor in terms of their economic outcomes. Just to give a little bit more about the design here, these villages have about 400 households in them on average. About a quarter of them are eligible for the receipt of one of these 2 types of transfer. And so we have randomization both across villages and within village. So within treated villages, we didn't have the financial resources to treat all of the eligible poor. So we randomly assigned within village assignment to receive the poor, to receive the transfer. So we'll observe both treated poor households as well as not treated poor households within the same village. And this is going to be a partial population experiment. We're also going to sample non-poor households altogether. So we're going to try to keep track of the economic preferences of 3 different types of households: the treated poor, the non-treated poor, and the non-poor, all of whom reside in the same community, some of whom are treated, but all of them get to observe these households being treated. The sample sizes are such that we're going to follow the universe of treated and not treated poor in these villages, so about 8,000 households. And then we have a random sample of households from other wealth deciles who were never eligible for the program. So we're going to be tracking about 17,000 households over the course of 4 years post-intervention to look at both the short-term and long-term impacts on economic preferences of these types of social protection program. So as I said, there's an existing sort of evidence base that documents that these types of policies, big push policies, have very large impacts on the economic well-being of the poor. So I'm not going to show you too many of those results. In this paper, we actually have a separate paper that really looks at the differential impacts of these two types of policies in this setting. To a first approximation, the economic impacts of these two policies are going to be very similar on households. So I'm going to bundle them together for the purposes of the talk. And I can talk about differentials later in the Q&A. And so we're going to combine those treatments and really think of how does either of these forms of pro-poor transfer impact economic preferences of those directly impacted versus others in their community. And just to reiterate, we're doing this in the context of a village economy setting. So relative to economy-wide studies, we think that there's going to be far less asymmetric information. Households are going to see other households being treated. We're going to have both changes in the levels as well as the distribution and ranking of households in various economic outcomes. And so we think these economic gains will be observable to others and more noticeable to households themselves. So to give you a sense of what happened, say, for example, to consumption in these villages as a result of these transfers, the next table just shows you what happens to the levels of consumption as well as overall levels of inequality in consumption. I'll focus in on food consumption. So the 2-year impact is to increase food consumption by about 4 percentage points for the treated poor relative to the not treated poor. And that impact is sustained 4 years out. That's a fairly large change in the ranking of these households within these villages. And you see similar impacts on non-food expenditure occurring by the 4-year end line of the study. As a consequence of that, because there are no spillover effects of the program onto the not treated households or the non-poor, you have substantial reductions in village level inequality measured by standard deviations of the log of food expenditure. So you have about a 12% reduction in inequality in these villages as measured by consumption changes. It's kind of hard to think of other policies that have such dramatic impacts on inequality in society, but we're really thinking of these village economies as essentially, 100 different laboratories in which to study what happens when you change the position of the poor and, relatively dramatic changes in inequality. You might think that consumption is relatively hard to observe for other households, but in the other paper, we document how there are, measurable impacts on easier to observe dimensions of economic well-being. So for example, the treated poor have improvements in their housing quality. There are very large improvements, gains in terms of the likelihood that they own livestock and the value of livestock owned. And the reason why that all of this sort of feeds through to some of their beliefs is that the poor, by taking on these assets or using the cash to buy assets, start engaging more with the market. They generate some of these returns from these assets by selling the produce, the milk and the meat that they generate into the market. And so they start entering supply chains. And so that's kind of like our initial conditions being changed of the poor in response to these policies. So the first set of outcomes I just want to show you, how does this, in terms of economic preferences, is what households believe about redistribution. So the first question we asked was, should the rich give part of their income to the poor? Over 90% of households across the wealth distribution agree with that. So we're going to see relatively small changes there. And then we asked households about the following wording in terms of what would happen if households received just a windfall, a very large one-time windfall of resources, which was as a result of luck. Should they be taxed by the government to raise funds for the poor? And we asked that over a 1-year time frame and a 5-year time frame. So I'll show you how that changes, how the preferences for redistribution change, first amongst the treated poor in response to these questions. So as I said, the vast majority of households think that the rich should give to the poor. You see, almost a last mile problem being solved. There are a little bit of a nudge up for households saying, those who didn't agree with that before, now agreeing with that sort of 2 and 4 years later. There's a slight sort of a greater demand for redistribution amongst the treated poor 2 years out. That effect kind of dies out for 4 years post-intervention. When we look at similar preferences for redistribution amongst the other two groups, we see that the not treated poor react slightly less in terms of having stronger preferences for redistribution that arise from a result of luck. But we do see the non-poor households, the very wealthiest households in these villages, also demanding more redistribution as a result of this. So this is very much, again, sort of a standard self-interest view, where you'd say that as you're changing people's position in the distribution, you might say that the non-poor would now demand less redistribution because the poor have been helped in their village. That's not what's going on. What we're seeing is that as the poor are being targeted by either form of transfer, the non-poor are actually becoming more favorable towards redistribution in these communities. And we'll explain the reason why in a few slides' time, I think. So there's a huge literature on understanding preferences for redistribution. And we get into this in the nitty-gritty of the paper. So there's one view that, you know, preferences for redistribution very much depend on whether individuals receive a change in their circumstances through luck or effort. We don't find much response to that. We don't find that that's really driving preferences for redistribution amongst any of our groups. What we find is that people's perceptions and concerns over inequality are highly inelastic, that there's very little change in what households perceive their place in the income distribution to be. They don't perceive you know, consumption inequality to have changed in their villages. So perceptions and concerns over inequality, as well as perceptions over their own relative standing, are very inelastic despite the big changes in economic outcomes and distributional impacts that we observe. There's a small change in social mobility. So we see the poor by the 4-year end line believing that they can get further along on a sort of a ladder of life type question. But there's also no changes in the ideal income distribution that any of the three groups perceive that's differential between treatment and control. The one robust margin that does determine sort of long run persistent impacts in becoming more pro-redistributive is in terms of your prior belief in the effectiveness of government. That those households who at baseline thought the government was very effective in this context significantly increased their demands for redistribution as a result of somebody in their village having been treated, and those impacts are very persistent over time. The problem is that only 1 in 4 households believe that the government in Pakistan is effective. And so on average, you don't see anything. And so that can lead to a somewhat vicious cycle where if people don't believe the government is effective, they don't want the government to do more things, even in the presence of, you know, very effective policies. Now, in terms of the other dimensions of economic preference, one of the ways that these pro-poor policies impact the lives and livelihoods of the poor is that it gets them to engage much more in market exchange, and as they move away from sort of a subsistence sort of a type of life. So we're going to measure their pro-market beliefs using the same questions that are used in the World Value Survey or in earlier work in relation to how pro-market beliefs respond to property rights. So these are the kinds of questions that we asked. And so what are the impacts on those pro-market beliefs? We see generally the poor become, you know, more pro-market as a result. If we just sum those different components, this is our overall index that I just want to highlight there. So for example, the poor become more likely to believe that effort is important for a successful life, that money is important for happiness, and this generalized notion of trust that you need to engage in sort of anonymized market interactions. So that's what happens to the treated poor, but we also see very similar changes in beliefs amongst the non-treated poor and the non-poor. They also become much more pro-market as a result. But again, in line with our earlier results, this is a short-run impact. This is something that tends to die out 4 years post-intervention, but is there in fairly equal magnitude across the wealth distribution 2 years later. So there is a separate literature that's been concerned with whether sort of increases in market engagement of individuals might then crowd out sort of their notions of social capital or their engagement in their own communities. And so this is an idea that goes back across, you know, many different economists. And so whether the notion that free markets might crowd out informal institutions. And in fact, you know, Michael Sandel's latest book is kind of suggesting that a free market-based meritocracy might be sort of what's eroding the common good and responsible for many of the ills that we see in the world today. And so we wanted to test that hypothesis here and see whether social capital is reduced, increased, or unchanged by a result of the policy. And what we find is that the two are actually complements, that the treated poor actually on these measures of social capital, we have additional measures as well, but these are the ones that I'm just showing you for the time being. Those again tend to improve in terms of trust in locals, a feeling of security, crime rates potentially going down. And so overall, in terms of the social capital index, you see that the treated poor have higher levels of social capital with their own community. And that again is something that we find is replicated when we move up the wealth distribution. So even amongst the non-treated poor who are being overtaken by the treated poor as a result of these interventions, we're seeing their social capital rising as well as the non-poor. And so this link between the social capital that the non-poor have, and remember the initial result that I showed you, that even the non-poor become more pro-redistribution in the face of these large-scale sort of big push transfers, is something that's also been hypothesized in sort of the redistribution literature, which is to say that by making the poor better off, the non-poor might feel more secure and therefore become more demanding for redistribution as a result of that. We do kind of see that cycle here in these villages over the first 2-year time period. Again, all of these effects tend to die out 4 years post-intervention. So what have we learned? So the question that we really started with is, do these pro-poor transfers generate further demands for redistribution amongst the population? In general, the result is no. By being a recipient or observing other households being a recipient of these types of big push policies doesn't lead to greater voter demands for increased redistribution in the long run. It only does so for that group who had high beliefs in government to begin with. But that's not the case for the majority of the population in our context. On the other hand, it doesn't lead to greater polarization. What we're not seeing is the views of some groups moving in one direction and the views of others moving in the opposite direction. We're actually seeing a homogenization of some of these views across the population. We see this very persistent gap between what we measure as changes in inequality, as measured by the quality of your house, your consumption, your non-food consumption, the value of assets that you own, and actually what people tend to perceive. There is that persistent wedge, a high degree of inequality, inelasticity in terms of these perceptions, and quite a big wedge between those perceptions and what we can actually measure in terms of hard economic outcomes. But it's also the case that pro-poor transfers, at least for the first 2 years, do foster pro-market views and foster social capital. It's not that the two are viewed as a sort of a zero-sum game within these communities that has been a concern sort of stemming back many decades. But what are the implications here? Well, the dynamics really matter here. In the long run, these economic preferences are inelastic, even though these are very big push pro-poor policies. So remember, these are contexts in which 10% of the economy is treated. We know from this work and previous work that these types of asset transfer or large-scale unconditional cash transfer have huge rates of return. We think they work, they're effective for those who are targeted, and there are large distributional effects on these village economies. Despite all of those things, you don't really get persistent changes in economic preferences from having experienced or seen others experience those types of policies. So it's kind of hard to think of economy-wide social policies that would have such large redistributive effects. So things like the minimum wage have a far smaller impact on society than sort of the numbers here within these village economies. And so that gets us to think, well, if we bring these results up to date and think how they might sort of shape current views with regards to, a shock which is as big as we can imagine, such as the current pandemic. So, given fiscal capacity within countries, what might be politically feasible responses to the current crisis may well depend in many countries on the elasticity of economic preferences. And so if they're relatively inelastic, even for these types of shock, it may take a very big shock for people to start changing their views. Unfortunately, there's some fairly downbeat evidence coming from the UK, from Bobby Duffy and other, his co-authors, group of political scientists based at King's College London, where they've surveyed the population in the UK. They have some really shocking findings that half of their respondents believe that those individuals who lost their job in the current pandemic did so because of their own fault. hasn't really led to greater demands for redistribution in the UK. So I think this kind of gets us thinking back, well, how will voter demands change in the face of the current pandemic? And it's a fairly downbeat conclusion, I think, that it's kind of hard to imagine these preferences shifting much if they don't do so in the context that we've studied. And so that's where I want to conclude.
Thank you, Imran. That was wonderful. Do we have questions for Imran? Please just put them in the chat or feel free to raise your hand. Christina Halaz, for some reason, who is helping organize the conference, is not able to raise her hand in a ironic turn of events. So I'll read her question out. Her question was, and Adnan answered this a bit, but was, what do you make of the fact that the effects show up after 2 years, but then they go away after 4 years?
So when you trace out the pattern of economic impacts, the change in those really occurs between the first, from the intervention over the first 2 years. After that, the effects are sustained, but they're not continuing to increase. So if economic preferences are shaped by changes in people's circumstances, then that delta is essentially in the first 2 years. After that, people become habituated to the change and their preferences revert back.
Got it. Thank you. We'll go to Kate Orkin, then we have a couple of questions in the chat as well.
I guess I was interested because, fascinating to see it in the context of this type of program. I think there's been some of the work showing a bit of a phenomenon of the poorer people who get these transfers kind of kicking the ladder up beneath them, which I think is not what you're finding. I wondered if you had any evidence of that, and if not, I think that's been found in developed countries, but also in places like Ethiopia with housing lotteries and things. So it's an interesting and different finding, and I wondered if there was something about the context that might explain that.
So when you look at the World Value Survey and compare Pakistan to the US, it's actually much more similar to the US on a lot of these measures than it is to India. The one place where India and Pakistan are very close is they're both sort of very low levels of generalized trust. But in terms of concerns for inequality, it's actually remarkably similar to the US. So we don't find much evidence of them wanting to kick away the ladder. The only element of that we find is amongst the not treated poor, seem to be much more sympathetic to individuals receiving transfers out of luck. And so their demands for redistribution in those circumstances falls, whereas others seem to want to have more redistribution in that case. That's the only case where we see households who are being overtaken respond slightly differently than those who benefited directly.
Great. So we have a question from Siddharth George from BU. Do you think that backlash by the non-treated poor would be larger if the program was targeted along ethnic lines? If, for instance, pre-existing ethnic inequality meant that poverty was concentrated in certain groups?
That could be. We have a lot of variation in ethnicity in our villages, so we haven't started really to dig into that a little bit. But one result I know off the top of my head is that the increases in social capital are larger in villages that were more unequal to begin with. So there is some important interaction in responses to these policies and sort of the social structure or initial conditions in the village. So we're starting to dig into that a little bit. And we've just put together the data recently on ethnic divisions, but we'd have to look at that in a little bit more detail, whether there's sort of a particular label that goes along. I mean, some of the things that Abhijit was describing and sort of Michael Sandel's kind of talked about in his book, that when you give transfers, you're also sort of labeling people as potential failures, and that might mean people view them slightly differently. But we did ask the poor as well, sort of how they think, why they think the rich are rich, whether that's because they're more educated, they're more skilled, they work harder, or whether because they commit crime, or whether they engage in special interest. Those views of why the rich are rich don't change as a result of the treatments either.
Thank you. So one last question, and then we'll move to the next panelist. There's a lot of questions, so hopefully we can come back to some of these in the general discussion later. So one last question from Stephanie Aldaz. Do you have any data on why economic preferences towards pro-poor transfers do not go up despite such good results from these efforts? So there's such great results. So do you have a sense of why preferences towards these kinds of transfers don't go up.
So I didn't understand the question. Towards these types of.
So, so given that you do see such terrific results from the interventions, from the redistribution, do you have a sense of why preferences towards pro-poor transfers don't increase more?
So in the short term, there is a slight increase in preferences for redistribution, and that's across the board. We think that might be slightly different for the reasons why the poor want more redistribution, because they see this as effective, and why the non-poor want more redistribution because they feel more secure and social capital's risen and that benefits them. But in the longer term, that's where we don't see any persistent change in these preferences, perhaps because people get used to those changes.
Thank you, Imran. We unfortunately now have to move to our next speaker, and we can keep this conversation going at the end. So we now have Xin Yang. Great, Xin Yang from Yale in the psychology department, speaking about motivated reasoning of social inequalities. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you so much for all the organizers. And hello, everyone. My name is Xin Yang. I usually go by Kate. And today I'm happy to share some work on children's motivated reasoning of social inequalities. This work is in collaboration with my PhD advisor, Yarrow Dunham. And I guess this whole work is very different from like most of the talks that people have heard today. And I'm very interested in the other work, but this one is more focused on developing population and it's an in-lab study. So we live in an unequal world and the wealth gap has been increasing over the past years. Such inequalities have brought social consequences, influencing social relationships, health, politics, and education outcomes, just to name a few. I study this phenomena from a developmental perspective. As children grow up and navigate a social world full of inequalities, how do they understand these inequalities and become supporters or opponents of social justice and equality? These questions are important as today's children will become tomorrow's political actors, and their early intuitive theories of social inequalities might persist and further influence how the future society tackle issues related to justice and equality. A lot of my recent work has been focused on exploring children's developing understandings of social inequalities across cultures. So far, we have the first comprehensive set of findings from the US and Turkey. In these studies, we introduced participants into two novel social groups living in a faraway mountain. One of the groups have nice houses, playgrounds, and toys. The other group does not, showing children salient wealth and poverty cues without mentioning the words rich or poor. In this work, we found a gradual decline in children's favorable attitudes towards the rich. Younger children in both the US and Turkey show a pro-rich bias. So these 4 to 5-year-olds like the rich more than the poor. But older children around middle childhood do not show this bias. In children's perception of inequality, we also found a gradual decline in that younger children either think that inequality is fair or they are unsure, but older children around middle childhood think inequality is unfair. Other studies also found that children at these middle childhood ages rectify inequalities by allocating more resources to the poor if given a chance. So we see that children gradually become less pro-rich and they rectify inequalities when they are asked about these abstract concepts in the lab. However, in the real world, adults frequently justify and perpetuate inequalities. So how do inequality rectifying children become inequality justifying adults? In this current work, I aim to explore this paradox. Here, I consider one potential answer, which is that people who benefit from the system, for example, rich people, are motivated to downplay inequalities and justify their advantage. I call this motivated reasoning tendency. So just as shown in this picture, while poor people ask for positive social change to reduce inequality and poverty, the rich guy is clearly not seeing inequality as a serious problem. So people in different social groups hold very different opinions about social inequalities. If this view is correct, once we make children fully aware of their positions, Especially if we tell them that they are at the top of the social ladder, we can expect to see stronger pro-rich attitudes as well as more inequality perpetuating actions and justifications. So let me walk you through the current study design. We first introduced participants into these two novel social groups as described earlier. But before reviewing any wealth information, we divided them into three subgroups. The first subgroup did not get any new information at this stage, but the other two subgroups were randomly assigned to one of the two novel groups. We simply told children that the computer would flip a coin to decide which group they would join. Then we told all participants that one of the novel groups had the nice stuff, while the other did not, in the same way as I presented earlier. So this essentially put children into three between subject conditions: no assignment control, assigned to rich, and assigned to poor. Then we probed three components with different dependent measures, which I will describe in more detail in the next slides. Here I want to say that we also make sure that children remember the wealth status of the two groups, as well as their own group memberships if they were assigned to a group. So different from most of the other work we've heard yesterday today. So here we actually just use novel groups and a random assignment procedure because we want to experimentally test this motivated risk tendency in the lab. This way we can provide a causal test of the basic underlying cognitions that's independent of any rich real social groups in the world. The final sample included 180 US children. They were all tested online one-on-one during Zoom meetings with our research team because of COVID. The participants were mostly white and they are from middle to upper middle class families. These children also view their own family as not rich or poor, but somewhere in the middle, as shown in our child-friendly measure of subjective SES. We had approximately 30 children in each of the age group by condition cell. We tested 5 to 6-year-olds and 8 to 9-year-olds, as my past work has found developmental changes in understandings of social inequalities between these age groups. Now moving on to measures and results, here are the three components we tested. The first, for the affective component, we measured children's relative attitudes towards the two groups. To orient you to the result plot, here on the x-axis, we had these three conditions. On the y-axis, higher values indicate stronger pro-rich biases. These two colors represent the two age groups. Let's first look at the results for children who were not assigned to a group. As I found before, younger children showed a pro-rich bias and older children did not. So children reduced pro-rich attitudes as they grew up. And also just to quickly note that in all of these plots I'm showing today, arrow bars are 95% confidence intervals. So, but what would happen if we assign children to the rich group? They show stronger pro-rich bias. So confirming the motivated reasoning tendency, children who were assigned to a rich novel group showed stronger pro-rich attitudes. How about children who were assigned to the poor group? Their pro-rich bias did not significantly differ from control. For behavioral intention component, we measured children's resource allocation decisions. We were interested in comparing their allocations of two different types of resources. Necessary resources like medicine, which we told children that they could save lives, and luxury resources like toys. Based on prior work, for the control condition, we expected children to allocate necessary resources equally. But for allocations of luxury resources, older children might give more to the poor to rectify inequalities. However, it's an open question whether children are not motivated to perpetuate inequalities once they are assigned to the rich group. Here, I plot the resource allocations of the two different types of resources side by side. On the y-axis, positive values indicate giving more resources to the rich, which I call perpetuating inequalities, while negative values mean that they rectify inequalities. Values not different from 0 means that they allocate resources equally. Next, I will walk you through the important findings one by one. First, we will focus on allocations of medicine. Let's also start by looking at the control condition. So younger children allocated medicine equally, and older children even give more to the poor, so they rectify inequalities at baseline. So there's also an age effect. We saw more inequality rectifying behaviors with age. However, when children were assigned to the rich group, They displayed more inequality perpetuating behaviors that were consistent with the motivated reasoning tendency. So now younger children give more medicine to the rich, and older children also change in the same direction. As for children who were assigned to the poor group, again, their results did not differ from control. When allocating toys, older children in the control condition showed more inequality rectifying behaviors as we expected. Assigning children to the rich group didn't change results. However, assigning them to the poor group made younger children give more resources to the poor, the only place we saw inequality rectifying behaviors in younger children. This finding also suggests that we could get younger children to rectify inequalities in allocations of luxury resources by putting them in the shoe of the poor. The last and perhaps most novel measure is on children's system justifying beliefs. We ask 7 false choice questions. To make these questions more child-friendly, we introduce children to different animal characters. Each question featured 2 animals. One of them showed system justifying beliefs, while the other did not. We asked children who they thought was right. This way, it's easier for younger children to express their opinions. Some of these questions presented opinions specific to the current situation. For example, asking whether we need to change anything with the 2 groups, or whether we should redistribute the resources such that the rich group would give more resources to the poor group. And moving beyond the current situation, the other questions were framed more broadly or future-oriented. For example, asking children's general beliefs about whether rewards or punishments are fairly given, or whether everyone can get rich if they work really hard. Here, I plot the results for these 2 different framings side by side. On the y-axis, higher values indicate stronger system justifying beliefs. Next, I will present the findings one by one. When asked about the specific inequality we depicted, children in the control condition actually did not justify this inequality. However, when children were assigned to the rich group, younger children increased system justifying beliefs, while older children did not. This result in younger children supported the motivated reasoning tendency. It also suggests that this tendency might emerge early and naturally in life, and older children might have learned to control it, at least on these very salient and straightforward questions. Children in the poor condition did not differ from control. In comparison, on these broader questions, children responded at chance. This is perhaps because children were unsure about these more general questions, and assignment to a novel group did not change their understandings of the broader society. So taken together, by merely assigning children to a rich novel group in an experiment, we induced stronger pro-rich attitudes, more inequality perpetuating allocations of necessary resources, and in younger children only, stronger system justifying beliefs about the specific and current unequal situation. So this finding supported the motivated reasoning tendency, showing that even under a very minimal setup, we see evidence of motivated reasoning of social inequalities. With a developmental approach, we also show that such a motivated reasoning tendency emerges early and perhaps naturally in life. That said, we do not need to be too pessimistic, as interventions to overcome this tendency and are also potentially more effective at these ages when these understandings are just forming, a topic I'm planning to explore more in my next studies. And with that, I want to thank my PhD advisor and collaborator and everyone who helped with this work. And thank you all for listening. And I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Kate.
Thank you.
Yeah, Catherine?
These are great presentations. Yeah, thank you for both of them. I am wondering if you have, Kate, if you have any ideas for, how do you mitigate? You're talking about interventions and next steps, but I'd just like to hear more about how you're thinking about that, how you might mitigate this natural process.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. And I really like to share. This is very early work. I'm currently in the designing and piloting stage for the next step. But one thing I'm thinking about doing, like I already proposed that before for my dissertation, is that we want to see whether different kind of narratives we tell children. For example, when parents read children's book to children, something says like the little engine that can. So for those kind of more internally framing stories, so like you tell children that everyone can get successful, can achieve if they really want to, if they really try hard. So those kind of narratives we call more internally focused might make children, like in a sense that they will think the poor people are poor because they just didn't try that much. So this kind of narrative, like in contrast to maybe we can present stories where a little engine succeeds, but not because of anything internal, but maybe just because the hill is just turned out to be not that deep at all, or somebody else helped, like things like that. So I'm thinking about developing any other kinds of more external focus, like narratives, to see if we frame things in different way, even if we're not talking about rich and poor per se, but just like other things that give children a different kind of framing would help them change in the direction we wanted.
Just to, if I can follow up on that, we've been doing some research over COVID, over the pandemic, and we find that giving adults that sort of narrative where, you know, you talk about the added value of support to keeping people on track, actually reduces Protestant work ethic beliefs. So there's some, support for that direction as well.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. Thanks, Catherine. Mahesh, you have your hand up.
Yeah, hi, Kate. Yeah, that was really interesting work, and kind of, I guess, related to what you were just talking about for the interventions you had. I think it makes sense. And actually, we also, just to share some related work, that we find that if children are given like a structural framing for why there's a resource inequality, so like, you know, one group is essentially systematically disadvantaged due to the nature of being in that group, then even preschoolers will rectify the inequality. So it's, I think these sort of like trends that you're showing, potentially these developmental trends of preferring the rich or only later in life, or you know, or resource, you know, or rectifying the inequality only later in life, might just have something to do with how accessible the explanation is for why the inequality exists in the first place, where younger kids sort of have difficulty sort of thinking about that as an explanation. But if they're provided with that, then they can sort of change that sort of earlier in life. But I guess the question that I actually had was, I don't know if you actually already addressed this, but I was just curious why you thought that the children who were assigned to the poor condition weren't showing an effect relative to the control condition. So it seems like the assignment to the rich condition sort of led to this sort of motivated reasoning of ignoring the inequality, but, you know, why was it not the case that being assigned to the poor condition made them more sensitive to the inequality?
Yeah, that's a good one. So for the first one, I would love to hear more about your work on this. We can talk about this more. There's been like a growing literature in structural interventions and things like that. And I also have some other work on like getting children to think more structurally about gender differences in the world, help them to like not think that negatively about gender non-conforming peers, like things like that. And also the other points, actually, I was considering another direction of the effect. So based on the system justification literature in like adult social psych, it's actually like, so both people who are at the top and at the bottom of the social ladder have reasons to show this motivated reasoning to justify inequality. So for people who are poor, they may want to be motivated to believe in a just world that they can say like, I'm currently poor, that's because like that's not because of something I can change. I can actually change. Like I can believe in a future where I'm richer because I can like work harder and things like that. So there has been work with adults like in the real world showing that people who are lower in SES have a stronger belief in like motivated reasoning and believe that the world is just and they justify inequalities. So when moving into this work, when we test children and with novel groups, I focus on the richer end, not the poor end, because I thought maybe in a more like experimentally, like random setting, children in the poor group may not show this kind of like biases that much as adults in the real world. But I also think your opinion, like your prediction on the other direction of the effect is also equally interesting. Maybe our assignments effect for children in the poor group is not as salient because they are overall like middle class, around middle class. They are very different from the children we assign them to, like the stimuli we showed are very, very poor. So maybe they are not that, like they don't reconcile with that much. So they don't have that kind of strong like cognitive dissonance, but we can try maybe in future work to show like maybe children who are like just be reminded that there are people who are much, much richer than them in the real world. And now they are still maybe middle class, but they are now poorer, like in that spectrum, and also more real world like. So in those cases, maybe we can expect to see different things. Maybe as you predicted, all the other way around for the justifications stronger in poorer people, in adults.
So we have a question in the chat that's related to Mahisha's question, but maybe in the interest of time, what we can do is go to the next session, and then Bruce, I'll come back and ask you to ask this question in the discussion at the end. Okay, so let's move on to our third speaker, final speaker of this panel, of this session, which is Katrina Kosek. Katrina, I hope I'm pronouncing your name properly.
Yeah, Katrina Kosek.
Kosek, okay.
Perfect. Let's minimize that. Can everyone see my screen all right?
Yep.
Perfect. Thank you. Well, I'd like to thank the organizers, a very exciting event. I'm going to be presenting a paper, Perceptions of Relative Deprivation and Women's Empowerment. This is joint work with Cecilia Moe from UC Berkeley Political Science Department, as well as my colleagues Emily Schmidt and Jay Song from the International Food Policy Research Institute. All right, so what is the research question we're analyzing? And in this paper, we're considering how do perceptions of one's relative economic status affect gender attitudes? And we're going to be looking at two separate features. We're going to be looking at women's economic participation, their working and receiving education and building their human capital, as well as women's empowerment with respect to decision-making in two domains, in particular within their community, as well as within their own household. Now, the motivation for this paper is the fact that there is growing income inequality in some countries, and in particular in developing countries. Oh, sorry about that. Goodness. We'll go through back to the beginning. Apologies. Not sure how that happened. So we have Control L. That working again? Perfect. Sorry. So we have this growing income inequality. I'm sorry, I'm clicking on something. Apologies. Okay. And then also we have the fact that the salience of income inequality itself is also increasing simultaneously. But at the same time, we have little knowledge of how inequality and sort of feeling relatively deprived actually affects women's empowerment. Now, on the one hand, we could think that feelings of relative economic vulnerability might engender some sort of social intolerance, as has been shown in the literature, and that this could actually reduce support for women's empowerment. It's sort of perceived as a threat. But on the other hand, we can think of economic vulnerability actually increasing the salience of all the benefits of women being empowered. We know that there's more household income when women are empowered. They're often working in the labor force, and they also can contribute to more efficient land management in rural settings. And there's also evidence of better health, nutrition, and education outcomes when women are empowered. But of course, attributing causality is very challenging, as much of the literature has shown, and that's where we're going to try to come in. So we contribute to this question with a survey from Papua New Guinea. It was a field experiment using priming. First, to tell you a little bit about Papua New Guinea. 87% of the population is living in rural areas. It's a highly rural society, and the poverty rate is about 40%, living below the poverty line. Gender relations are unfortunately quite depressing. There's very high rates of domestic violence and aggression toward women and girls. Men are the owners and controllers of agricultural assets and other resources within their household. And women, while they have the opportunity to work, and in fact, 85% of vendors of goods happen to be women, so we know they're in the workplace, they're still expected to maintain defined female roles within their households, including cooking and cleaning and the like. So we carried out a survey in 2018 in Papua New Guinea, the Papua New Guinea Household Survey on Food Systems. And our sample that we'll analyze here comprises 1,372 individuals, slightly more women than men, but we're interviewing spouses within a household. And they come from 884 different households in 4 different areas, and they're randomized into treatment. We have a gender module that is completed by both the household head and their spouse. We did our best to separate them, and we're actually more effective separating women than men because the men were busy and wanted to be off. And we started this gender module with a priming experiment I'll show you now. And in particular, individuals were asked about their income, but we manipulated the answer choices. We asked them to choose an income bracket from 1 to 5. And our control group, who we call the no poverty prime group, was given a set of choices in which they were likely to be somewhere in the middle around bracket 3 at the median, and to kind of perceive that there's sort of this narrow distribution of income. And those who were treated, who we say received a poverty prime, were much more likely to be in the bottom income bracket at the median. That's where they were. And these are individuals who are sort of made to perceive the income distribution as being wider than it actually is and locating themselves in the bottom of this. And our motivation here is the fact that individuals' perceptions of their relative economic standing have been shown to be influenced by researchers. They think that when researchers give them a set of questions, that researcher is sort of expecting them to be in the middle of these income brackets. And when they don't fulfill that, they can feel relatively more poor. Now, our empirical strategy involves individual level analysis that we disaggregate by gender, and our outcome is the extent of agreement or disagreement with a gender-related statement. And we recoded these just to help you out in this presentation in the paper, where a positive coefficient is going to be indicative of more support for women's empowerment, more egalitarian and progressive gender attitudes. And we're standardizing here using the mean and the standard deviation of the control group so that we can sort of interpret standard deviation effects here. And P, this main independent variable you'll want to pay attention to, is a dummy for receiving a poverty prime. Now, our main outcomes, first, when we're looking at economic participation, we have 2 questions on, and this is a very brief survey for many reasons. It was a challenging setting in which to travel, so we had a limited space. But our questions about economic participation were about prioritizing boys for education and for reserving jobs for men when jobs are scarce. And our questions about women's roles in decision-making were to what extent individuals think that men should have the final say about decisions in their community, and to what extent husbands should make the decision about managing household assets like farm equipment. We also wanted to explore a little bit about where and our effects are coming from. So we asked a few questions about attitudes regarding how women's work affects other people, whether it prevents men from getting jobs or whether it harms children who might be neglected at home. And then we asked questions about the degree of social conservatism, and in particular, whether they think a good woman should support her husband's opinions and that women should abide by traditions like their mother's generation. Now, looking to the results here, this first table is showing you the effects of our poverty prime on women's economic participation. And we're seeing that for both genders, we see some positive effects, relatively unambiguously so for the case of men. Being primed to feel poor makes men more supportive of women having jobs. So they disagree that jobs should be reserved for men. And it makes men more supportive of girls' education. In particular, they disagree that education should be prioritized for boys. For women, the effects are mostly coming in the jobs area, that women become more supportive of women of working and less so in education. But we see these large and similar sized effects across the 2 genders. Next, let's turn to decision making. Again, remember, we have the community domain and we have the household domain. And we see that the poverty prime, so feeling relatively poor and deprived, doesn't really affect how anyone views how community decisions should be made. But when we consider within the household, being primed to feel poor and deprived makes women more likely to oppose the husband doing all the household management decisions. Women want more power when they feel relatively poor and deprived. But we see no such effect for men, much smaller point estimate, statistically insignificant. So we have this potential situation for tension in the household where being primed to feel poor makes everyone think women should be working, and it makes women want to have more decision-making power, but men are happy with the status quo on decision-making and having that continue to be dominated by men. Now, we kind of wanted to see where these effects were coming from, and this graphic or this table shows you that it's those people who felt before treatment that already felt that they were relatively high, that felt that they were high in the income distribution. Those are the people who seem to be driving these effects. And that's as we would expect, because if you already feel really poor and deprived, then being primed to feel poor and deprived is not going to have much of an effect on you. And that is indeed what we find. Now, we wanted to see what might be driving this. So we first considered how women's work affects others. And our poverty prime does not change any perceptions for any gender about the extent to which women's work negatively affects children or negatively affects other men. We next looked at social conservatism, and we find that the poverty prime also did not affect social conservatism for either gender. So nobody's kind of changing their attitudes. This kind of checks with reality in the sense that we don't think massive changes in perceptions of what happens in the reality and in the working world actually are going to change, but the perceived need to work and generate income might. So to conclude, what we find is that feeling economically left behind, being in a priming experiment where you're primed to feel relatively poor and deprived, seems to be capable. And this is a light touch, right? This is a very light touch. So we find this interesting suggestive evidence that you can engender more openness to women's economic participation and maybe even girls' education by increasing the salience of poverty for some groups, and in particular, the relative position in the distribution of income. And then we interestingly find that these feelings that everyone, all hands should be on deck, everyone should be working, prompt women to want decision-making authority within their homes to accompany the types of feelings they're having about needing to work as well, but men want to retain the status quo. So this suggests, at least in the way we interpret it, that societal income inequality, to the extent that it makes some individuals feel relatively poor and deprived, could actually trigger greater intra-household tensions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Katrina. That was fantastic. So we have our, do we have a hand up? Mish, was that your hand up or no? I don't think so. I think that was a leftover from before. Are there questions for Katrina?
I actually had, sorry, I can't raise my hand, but I had a clarifying question, Katrina. Could you say why you framed the gender attitude questions as disagreement with the norms as opposed to agreeing with maybe more like progressive norms? Like why would you ask a question about disagreement with men should make community decisions as opposed to maybe like, oh, women should also make community decisions, and having people agree with that? I'm just kind of curious about the framing.
Yeah, no, so I mean, we did have, and then the more details in the paper that I apologize, I was not have the time to go through entirely in great detail, but we had sort of there were five potential responses to these questions. It's true that the questions were sort of generally framed in this way of throughout the non-egalitarian attitude. Honestly, we had a bit of pushback from our survey firm in general about framing questions that seemed like we were pushing a gender equality agenda, which made me kind of depressed. But this was in Papua New Guinea, doesn't have many surveys coming there. It was 10-hour canoe rides to get to some of these sites. So it was a very challenging setting, and we had to go by that. I'm not sure the extent to, I know that there's definitely research showing that the way you frame these questions matters, right? So perhaps further research can see if there's sensitivity to that. But thanks for that question, Christina.
I had a question, or maybe just an observation. So, there are certain settings where, as people get richer, female labor force participation goes up, and there's other settings where it like goes down. But usually it goes up. So, like as countries get richer, female labor force participation goes up. Which on the surface might feel counter to what you're finding. But I think one exception in a context that I know better than others is in India, actually the pattern really matches what you're finding, where as people get richer, it's actually like an inverse U-shape. So as people, or sorry, a U-shape. So as people get richer, they're less likely to work in the labor market, or women are less likely to work in the labor market. And then at some point at the high end of the spectrum, like women enter the labor force again, like in white collar corporate jobs. And I'm wondering if Papua New Guinea is the same, or how this might like help us, understand like patterns of labor force participation.
Very good question. I'm fascinated by this and where we are on the U-shaped distribution that you've mentioned. I think my take of it is that Papua New Guinea is on that sort of left side of the U, so that we're kind of seeing a situation in which, as you kind of move to the left and become more poor, you have this increase in participation. To the extent that these types of responses are similar in other contexts, I think is very important. My co-authors and I are now exploring the same question in Nepal, and that is a similar setting. So I'm not sure we'll learn a lot about that, but we're going to look at some heterogeneity and poverty. But we're also kind of interested in how the outlet of migration and men possibly earning more income by migrating themselves as opposed to putting their wives to work, so to speak, might affect things. But we appreciate any feedback or thoughts anyone further has on that point.
Great. So maybe one thing we could do is we have a couple more questions for Katrina, but maybe we can open it up to the entire panel just to not get too behind on time and keep the conversation going. So Rebecca Lillman has a question on why you're interpreting the results as increasing intra-household tension rather than increasing women's empowerment.
Yeah, so I think it's responding mainly to the fact that women's empowerment involves sort of an agreement. We know that when men and women agree that women are involved in a decision, that often reflects more more power for women than when men are claiming that women don't have authority to do something that they claim or want authority to. And we also have to remember this is a preference. This is a preference for women's involvement as opposed to women indicating they're involved. So again, when women have a preference that men do not share, that's when we can think of this as not being a real improvement in empowerment. I don't know if that answers the question.
Great, thank you. And then Kate, your fellow panelist, Kate, had a question. Kate, do you want to just ask your question directly? Are you able to unmute yourself?
I just got that notification to unmute. So yeah, this is very good research. And I'm just wondering also, like in relation to the previous question, whether we can interpret this whole set of results as some kind of weird advantage for being in poverty in some sense, at least for like that U-shaped one, like especially for the left part. Like if you are poor, you have maybe even equal allocation of like household labor.
Yeah. We were really hoping it was sort of this really nice silver lining. I think the fact is, though, we did focus groups to try to understand this a little better. And women were basically saying working is a risky business because you're going to get beaten if you don't do all the homework as well. So we sort of learned very quickly to interpret work outside of the home not as a luxury of women pursuing their passions, but rather of women doubling up on the amount of work that they're actually doing. And so that's sort of why we have not interpreted this in a better lens, to the extent that, our thought is, to the extent that you have a push towards support for women entering the labor force like you might see here, you really need to complement that with programming that maybe gets couples workshops or trainings where men become advocates and supporters of finding other ways to share the household labor, for example, in order to make that more of a possibility. I know there's a lot of work in Africa being done. My colleague Kate Ambler has been working in Uganda with couples workshops to try to promote more empowerment of women in their homes and in joint decision making. But I think that that's critical to really make a push into the workforce, net beneficial for women. It seems like that type of complementary programming is probably necessary.
Thank you. Do others have questions for our panelists? So I have a question, Imran, for you related to your initial talk. So, and I think this touches on how redistribution happens. And so maybe Kate, you would have thoughts as well. But so what you're showing is that because people don't trust in the government's institutional capacity, they don't support redistribution. But maybe one implication of that is that they might support it through other means. And so, we've seen an increase in like the popularity of like Give Directly or other platforms where you could think about like redistributing directly. But philanthropy is not, I mean, the amount of money raised through philanthropy is not nearly as large as like general redistribution, like through the government. And I'm just wondering if from like a policy perspective, you see some scope or actually benefit of trying to have mechanisms where the government, rather than the government, for example, saying I'm going to tax you and then I'm going to redistribute, say giving a tax credit, like, you can deduct, like just like we allow charitable donations to be deducted, tax credits to say, I'm going to, in some sense, privatize, just like we privatize utilities, I'm going to privatize certain kinds of redistribution where like the best firms, you can go see their metrics online, whatever, the best NGOs redistribute. Do you feel like that's actually something that's sensible and would lead to a lot more redistribution? Is that an implication of your study?
I mean, the closest that we can get to that with what we measure is we ask people sort of trust in the private sector or in NGOs. And those are somewhat higher than trust in government in this setting, but still highly correlated. But it's because the intervention is essentially delivered by government agencies, the trust in government is really what's driving the sort of preferences for redistribution. Those other margins, even though they're quite correlated, in the end, they don't, your responses or the changes in demand for redistribution don't change depending on what you believe about the private sector or about NGOs. But in terms of sort of parallel systems of transfers, we do have lots of data sort of on household to household transfers, so charitable giving or whether other forms of transfers that take place. We're still putting that data together to see the extent to which there may be crowding in or crowding out of that type of informal assistance or that type of redistribution that may be much more first order in households' minds in this setting than what's going on sort of nationally.
Cool, that'd be really interesting. So we had a question, Kate, for you from Bruce Wittick. He was wondering, this was related a little bit to Mahesh's question, but he was wondering if some of the changes that you see as children get older, do you think that those are due to better understanding of how incomes are earned? That was kind of in line with Mahesh's intuition, or could it also just be decreasing compassion or changes?
That's a good point. Yeah, I guess to think about this question, we need to think about it more in a longer developmental lens. So like for my work, like the longest ages I tested were like 4 to 12-year-olds. During that age range, it's more likely that children are increasingly value fairness norms more like as they enter into middle childhood. So we saw more about like compassion for the poor, especially if they reduce privilege by some children they don't want to say, they just can't say they like the rich more because they saw the poor people will feel like sad, but like they don't have anything and you don't like them, like things like that. So we get lots of that kind of reasoning like when we test children at these ages. So I guess if there's anything about they now learn that maybe poor people don't work as hard or like poor people are not that kind of desirable, like things like that, those kind of reasoning, less compassion and stuff, that may happen after the childhood ages. So I would guess that happens more like as children enter teenage years, maybe like as they transit into early adults. And when we saw this lifelong changes about adults justifying inequalities more. So if that's a mechanism, I would guess that happens later after childhood.
Thank you. And then maybe the last question from Francisco. And then I think we'll go to break.
Thank you. Thank you for the great presentations. I just have a question. So we know that income inequality also come from, so we know income distribution, you have very rich, very poor, and people in the middle. So we know that there is some, from experiment from Kate, we know, we can see that kids, when they grow up, they might exhibit different perceptions through inequality. But what happens when they are in these extreme cases, very top or very bottom of the distribution? Do you see some aversion towards these changes in perception? So I don't know if extreme cases can create an aversion towards redistribution, and I don't know if some of the panelists have some answer to that.
Yeah, I can begin by sharing some other work, like our work. So like my work usually use these more extreme cases, like more because that we saw we want children to get this abstract concept very clear. Like if we can see something, like anything different between their conception of the rich and the poor, we'll get it more strongly in these more extreme cases. That's true, but also like there has been a lot of work with children, like even in the same ages as I tested, they use more like similar stimuli, like so the poor or the rich people, their houses are just like roughly similar. Maybe the richer houses are just like a little bit better than the poorer ones. So I would classify them more like they are all around the middle class layer, but some are higher than the other. So that might be more relevant to your question. So for those work, they also find that children at early ages, they prefer the rich more to the poor. So that happens, but the whole developmental changes were not documented very clearly in those works. So I came to just use more extreme stimuli and with wider age ranges to see this change. But based on that work with younger children, I would predict this change would happen similarly if we use more similar stimuli. And also for the adult work that I know that's conducted before, they also actually contrasted not just the poor or the rich, they also had middle class. So that's like a whole range of the spectrum. And they also found that even adults who are middle class, they don't explicitly say that they like the rich over the middle class. But if you ask them in a more implicit way, like whether they're for example, in an IAT or kind of implicit association test, you still see that they prefer the rich, like the upper class over the middle class. So that's a more concept-based measure. So it's not that you show them very salient stimuli, but more like in a screen, you show them words like upper class or middle class.
So I'm going to, I think, please feel free to keep the conversation going. I want to be cognizant of the cutting into the break time to try to catch up a little bit. So we're going to restart the next session at 12:05 Pacific, so in about 7 minutes. But please feel free to keep chatting, and if others have things to add on to the answer to this question, please continue to talk.